Beatrice Holt folded her hands in her lap the moment her husband said the wrong name, and every woman at that table felt it before any of them could say why. It was the kind of thing that happened quietly. Arthur Reeves had been speaking to Judge Caldwell about the new railway contract, the one that had kept Arthur in Philadelphia for 3 weeks in October and 2 weeks in November and most of December. And he had turned to gesture toward his wife at the far end of the table and said, with the easy confidence of a man who had never once doubted his own certainty, "You'll want to speak with Margaret about the guest arrangements. She has a gift for that sort of thing." Margaret was Arthur's mother. She had died 4 years ago. Beatrice had attended the funeral and organized the flowers. The table did not stop. It stuttered. A woman named Ruth Caldwell, the judge's wife, blinked once and looked down at her soup. The man to Beatrice's left reached for his water glass and missed it slightly. Arthur had already turned back to the judge and continued his sentence. Beatrice smiled. It was a perfect smile, the kind she had been producing for 7 years, warm and untroubled and just gracious enough to suggest the misunderstanding was not worth anyone's attention. "I'm happy to discuss the arrangements with anyone who'd like to," she said, her voice carrying the exact distance it needed to, and no further. And then she picked up her fork. She set it back down 3 minutes later, quietly, while Arthur was laughing at something the judge had said. No one at that table heard it. But Ruth Caldwell looked at her across the candlelight with the expression of a woman who understood everything and intended to say nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. Beatrice excused herself before the dessert course. She had a headache, she explained, and was so sorry to miss the rest of the evening, and she hoped everyone would stay as long as they liked. She said good night to each person individually, with the correct warmth and the correct particular detail, the kind that made people feel remembered. She told old Mr. Harwick that his speech at the county dinner had been genuinely moving. She told Ruth Caldwell that her brooch was extraordinary, which it was. Arthur glanced over from the far end of the table. "You're all right," he said. "Perfectly," Beatrice said. He nodded and returned to the judge. She walked upstairs and stood in the hallway outside their bedroom for a long time. The sounds of the dinner party drifted up from below, laughter and the scrape of chairs and the particular buzz of 12 people who were comfortable with each other and had no reason to leave early. Arthur's voice was audible through the floor, easy and certain, the voice of a man who had arrived at the age of 42, having never had to try very hard at anything. Beatrice went to the window at the end of the hall and looked out at the street. It was January in Boston, 1903, and the gas lamps made yellow circles on the packed snow below. She stood there until she was sure the expression had left her face. Then she went into the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed and was very, very still. She had managed this house for 7 years. She had managed Arthur's correspondence when his secretary fell ill, and Arthur had never thought to mention that he'd noticed. She had managed the social calendar for 3 separate political campaigns. Arthur had supported with his money and her labor, attending every dinner, every fundraising reception, every charity event where it was useful for Arthur Reeves to have a wife who knew how to work a room. She had managed his mother's final illness, the household accounts, the relationship with their landlord in Beacon Hill, the education of their youngest cousin who had come to live with them for 2 years while his parents settled a bankruptcy. She had managed it all with the kind of competence that made it look effortless, and things that look effortless attract no attention. That was the arrangement, though they had never discussed it as such. She made things work. He moved through a working house without thinking about why it worked. He had called her Margaret. She lay down on top of the coverlet without undressing and stared at the ceiling and thought about it. Not the name itself, but the texture of it. The ease, the way it had come out of his mouth, without hesitation, without self-correction, as though the woman at the foot of his table existed in his mind as a category rather than a person, someone who handled things. The name attached to the category was secondary. She thought about the year they had married. She had been 23. Her father's law firm had been in debt, and Arthur Reeves had been a man of considerable assets and a reputation for fairness. It had been a reasonable arrangement. She had known it was a reasonable arrangement going in, and she had told herself that reasonable was enough. that warmth and affection could grow from reasonable if you tended to it carefully. She had tended to it carefully. She had tended to it carefully. She had for 7 years, and she was lying on top of her coverlet in the dark, and downstairs a man who did not know her name was laughing with a judge about railway contracts. And she found that she was no longer willing to tell herself the stories she had been telling herself for 7 years. It wasn't a dramatic moment, no doors opening, no chains falling. It was quieter than that, more like a hand releasing something it had been holding for so long that the grip itself had been forgotten. She got up. She did not pack like a desperate woman. She moved through her dressing room with a single candle, working with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything. A small trunk. Her own correspondence, letters from her sister in Providence, from two women she had helped navigate property questions after their husbands' deaths, her financial records, the one she kept in a separate ledger, Arthur had never asked to see because the household accounts had always arrived correctly, and he had never needed to ask. A ring that had been her grandmother's. 3 dresses, the practical ones. Her winter coat, even though it was already January, because she was thinking beyond the season. She paused once over a photograph taken in their first year, the two of them standing outside the house on Boylston Street before they had moved here. Both of them squinting a little into the summer sun. She looked at the woman in it. Younger, composed, holding her smile with the careful precision of someone who had decided to make the best of things. She set it face up on the dressing table and moved on. The note she left was 4 sentences. She had thought about it before in the abstract. The way you think about things you believe will never happen. I have managed this house and this marriage with everything I had. I am not leaving in anger. I am leaving because the arrangement required me to disappear, and I find I am no longer willing. The household accounts are in order through the end of February. She did not sign it your wife. She signed it Beatrice. She placed it on his breakfast tray where the maid would find it in the morning. Then she carried her trunk to the back stairs, the ones the staff used, and let herself out to the kitchen and walked out into the January night. It was cold in a way that was immediately clarifying. 13 blocks to the station, and the first train to Providence left at 4 in the morning, which gave her 2 hours to walk there and wait. She had no plan beyond her sister's house in Providence, beyond a woman named Josephine who had written to her 3 months ago about a position organizing legal correspondence for a network of women navigating property courts, and whom Beatrice had written back to with careful, measured interest, and then set the letter aside, and then taken it out again 4 times. She had the letter in her coat pocket. She had put it there 2 days ago. She understood now, walking down the frozen street with her trunk bumping against her leg, that she had known then. Arthur Reeves found the note at 7:15 in the morning. His valet had brought the breakfast tray, had seen the envelope, had placed it beside the coffee without comment, because Thomas was a man who had served in large houses long enough to know that some mornings required discretion before they required explanation. Arthur read it once, quickly, the way a man reads something he expects to resolve into something manageable. Then he read it again because it hadn't. He set it down. He drank his coffee. Then he said to the empty room, "She's gone to her sister." He said it with the firm reasonableness of a man who had found the correct interpretation of a confusing situation. Beatrice visited her sister in Providence 2 or 3 times a year. She had simply gone and left the note, and it was phrased strangely, but Beatrice had always had a tendency toward precise language that could read as dramatic if you weren't accustomed to it. He had a meeting with the railway committee at 9. He went to the meeting. He did not send a message to Providence until the following day, when dinner had been served incorrectly, and he had spent an evening in his study with the persistent feeling that something in the house had gone quietly wrong in a way he couldn't locate. The reply from his sister-in-law, a woman named Frances, arrived 2 days later. Frances had her own particular gift for precision of language. She wrote 3 words. "She is not here." Arthur stood in the front hallway holding those 3 words and felt something shift, not fear, but something adjacent to it. The specific discomfort of a man who has been completely certain he understood a situation and has just discovered he didn't understand it at all. He sent for his oldest friend, a doctor named Henry Marsh, who had been at their wedding and had known both of them since before. Henry arrived that afternoon and sat across from him in the study and let him explain the situation. Arthur used the calm, controlled register he used for all difficulties. "She left," he said, "without telling me where she was going. The note was," he gestured toward the desk, "I need your help finding her." Henry picked up the note. He read it. His expression did not change, but something behind it did. "She said she was leaving," Henry said. "It was not quite a question. People say things when they're upset. Beatus doesn't say things she doesn't mean. You know that better than I do." Henry set the note down carefully. "Arthur, at the Caldwell dinner. What happened?" Arthur's jaw tightened. "I don't know what you're referring to." "You introduced your wife as Margaret." The words sat in the room. "It was a slip," Arthur said. "It was 7 years in a single sentence." Henry looked at him with the steadiness of a man who had run out of diplomatic approaches and was trying honesty. "She has been running your household, your social calendar, your mother's final months, and 3 of your political friends' campaigns. And you introduced her by your dead mother's name in front of a judge and 8 other witnesses, and you did not correct yourself. You turned back to Caldwell and finished your thought." He paused. "She didn't leave because you said the wrong name. She left because the wrong name proved something she had been watching for a long time." Arthur said, "That is not a fair reading of, tell me her sister's husband's name." Silence. "Tell me which guest at your last dinner she steered away from a conversation that would have embarrassed you, and how she did it." Silence. "Tell me the name of the woman whose inheritance case she helped resolve last spring through private correspondence, without telling you, because she knew you would find it unseemly." Arthur said nothing. Henry stood. "You are not a cruel man," he said quietly, "but you have been married to a capable woman for 7 years and treated her like excellent machinery, useful, reliable, requiring no acknowledgement because it always ran. And she has finally decided she would rather be a person somewhere else than machinery in a very well-appointed house." He picked up his coat. "I'll try to find her. But, Arthur, consider carefully what you intend to do when I do, because if you go to her expecting her to come home and resume her position, you will lose her permanently." He left. The house began to show its edges within 5 days. Arthur had known in the abstract that Beatrice managed things. He had simply never attached any content to the word because the result of her management was a smooth house that required nothing from him, which had always seemed like the point. He discovered the content of the word almost immediately. On Tuesday, he received a letter from the family's linen merchant indicating that a credit negotiation had lapsed, one that Mrs. Reeves had handled directly every winter and had saved them what the merchant estimated at $40 annually through her attention to contract terms. On Wednesday, the woman who came to do the weekly flowers did not know which rooms to arrange them in because she had always received a note from Mrs. Reeves the day before, and there was no note. On Thursday, he overheard 2 of the kitchen girls in the back passage, not knowing he was there. "She's not coming back," one of them said. "How do you know?" "Because of how she said goodbye to me Tuesday night." That was a goodbye. He walked past without acknowledging he'd heard. He went to his study and sat with the ledger she had left. Every entry in her careful, controlled handwriting, every transaction accounted for, every balance correct. She had prepared for this. Not recently. The preparation had the texture of months. That was the thing he had not expected. Not the leaving, the preparation. By the 3rd week, the whispers had reached his professional circle. Not from the house, the staff, it seemed, had developed a loyalty to Beatrice that survived her absence without instruction. But from Ruth Caldwell, who had spoken to Mrs. People, Harwick, who had mentioned it to someone else, and so it traveled. No one asked directly where Mrs. Reeves had gone. They asked in the particular careful way that Boston society had perfected, whether Arthur had heard from his wife, whether she was well, whether she was, and here the inflection carried everything, traveling, Arthur answered every inquiry with the composed certainty of a man who had not yet decided to be alarmed. She was visiting family. She was perfectly well. But the inquiries kept coming from people who should not have been inquiring, which meant the story had gone further than he'd calculated. Henry came back on the 16th day. He had information. He sat down and said, before he offered it, "I need to know what you intend." "I intend to bring her home." "No." Henry was quiet and firm about it. "You don't bring Beatrice anywhere. You ask and the answer may be no. She is my wife. She is a woman who left you a letter explaining exactly why she was leaving, who has been living independently for over 2 weeks without sending for help or returning, and who has given no indication she intends to." Henry looked at him steadily. "She is not lost, Arthur. She left. There is a considerable difference." A long silence. "Where is she?" "Providence, with her sister. But she's not staying. She's already found a position." Henry paused. "She's organizing legal correspondence for a network of women working through property cases. Widows, mostly, who lost their husbands and can't navigate the courts alone. She started 3 days after she arrived." Arthur said nothing. "She's good at it," Henry said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite admiration and not quite sorrow, but occupied the space between them. The kind of good that makes you realize she was doing this work half her life without anyone calling it work. He waited a moment. "She declined to see me. Sent word that she was not receiving visitors from the Reeves household." Arthur looked up. "She said that." Her sister delivered it very calmly, as though she'd been given those instructions and intended to honor them. The silence that followed this was different from the ones before it. Not the silence of a man who hadn't heard. The silence of a man sitting with something that had more weight than he'd expected. "I called her Margaret," Arthur said finally. "Yes, in front of everyone." "Yes, and I didn't." He stopped, pressed his hand against his desk. "I didn't know I'd done it." "I know you didn't," Henry said. "That's worse, isn't it?" Arthur stood and walked to the window. Outside, the January street had gone gray and quiet in the late afternoon. He thought about Beatrice walking down that street in the dark with a trunk. He thought about the fact that she had packed a trunk, had a letter in her pocket from a woman she'd been corresponding with for months, had said goodbye to the kitchen girls in a way they recognized as final, had left the household accounts current through February. "What do I do?" he said. It was the first time he'd said it as a real question, not a complaint dressed as a question. Henry considered it. "You start by understanding that this is not a problem to be solved. It is a wrong to be acknowledged. Those are not the same thing, and they do not use the same methods." He stood. "And then you wait, because she is not going to move toward you until she has seen, not been told, seen, that the man who comes to her is different from the man she left." He looked at Arthur with the directness of someone who had exhausted all the gentler approaches, "And if she never believes it, that is something you may have to live with. I want you to understand that it might come to that." He left. Arthur stood at the window for a long time. The street was entirely still. He had spent 7 years building a public life, a reputation as a capable man, a man of standing, a man whose household was an example of the right ordering of things. And Beatrice had been the quiet architecture of all of it. Invisible, the way load-bearing walls are invisible, noticed only when they're gone and the ceiling begins to shift. He had not understood until this moment that his reputation and her absence were the same problem. He wrote to her on a Thursday. He had written and thrown away 5 versions before settling on one that was 3 sentences, because every version longer than that had turned into a man making a case. He had finally understood, with Henry's voice somewhere in the back of his mind, that this was not a case to be argued. "I am not writing to ask you to come home. I am writing because I owe you an apology I do not know how to make. I would be grateful for the chance to attempt it in person, at a time and in a place of your choosing." He sent it. He waited 4 days. Her reply came on a Wednesday, in her handwriting on plain stationery, not the Reeves household stationery, her own. There is a public lecture at the Providence Athenaeum on Saturday afternoon. Mrs. Adler speaks on the legal standing of women in contested estate cases. I will be attending. I will not be attending with you, but I will not prevent you from attending the same public event." He read it 3 times. It was not an invitation. It was Beatrice operating with characteristic precision, drawing a line and leaving a door unlocked at the same time. He wrote back 2 words: Saturday afternoon. He arrived early and took a seat near the back. This was not where Arthur Reeves normally sat at any event. He sat near the back because he was not there as Arthur Reeves of the Railway Committee, man of assets and standing. He was there as a man who needed to see his wife across a room and had earned the right to nothing beyond that. The room filled. Mrs. Adler began. Beatrice arrived 8 minutes late with a woman he didn't recognize, mid-50s, plainly dressed, who deferred to Beatrice in small ways that indicated Beatrice was her guide through this particular room rather than the other way around. They found seats 4 rows from the front. Beatrice removed her gloves and opened a small notebook and did not look toward the back of the room. Arthur watched her for the better part of an hour. He had been married to her for 7 years, and he was watching her the way you watch a person you are seeing for the first time. She asked a question during the lecture. Sharp, specific, better than most of the questions that had come before it, and Mrs. Adler answered it with the slight recalibrating attention of a speaker encountering a sharper mind than she had anticipated. The woman beside Beatrice touched her arm briefly, the way you touch someone's arm when you're proud of them. Beatrice smiled. Not the smile from the dinner table. That smile had been a door closing. This one was simply open, hers for her own reasons. Afterward, when the room had thinned, he walked to her. They stood a few feet apart. Beatrice. Arthur. Her voice was even. Not cold, not warm. The careful neutrality of someone taking it 1 minute at a time. "You look well," he said, and meant it with more specificity than he'd expected, because she did look well. Not in the maintained way of a woman keeping up appearances, but in the way of a person who has found the temperature of their own life. "I am well," she said. Mrs. Adler's position on intestate cases could go further, but it's a start. She said it matter-of-factly, not performing expertise, just possessing it. The way she always had, he understood now. He had simply never stood still long enough to see it as anything other than background detail. "I came because I told you I owed you an apology," he said. "I still do. I keep starting from the wrong place." "What's the wrong place?" "Explaining myself. Justifying." He paused. "Every version I've written starts with me saying what I meant or didn't mean. And that's the problem, isn't it? Every version of everything for 7 years started with me." The room was nearly empty. The woman Beatrice had arrived with stood near the door, giving them space with the tact of someone who'd been briefed. Beatrice looked at him for a moment. "What are you asking, Arthur?" "I'm asking if you'll allow me to call on you. Not to persuade you of anything, just to say what I should have been saying for 7 years, to your face, and then accept whatever you decide." She was quiet. When she spoke, it was precise and quiet and absolute. "I do not think your regret is the same thing as my safety." The words went into him like a key turning. He did not answer immediately because there was no immediate answer worth giving. He stood with it, and she watched him stand with it, and the fact that he did not argue, did not reframe, did not fill the silence with a better version of himself, seemed to register somewhere in her expression. Not as forgiveness, as information. "No," he said finally. "It isn't. You're right." She was still a moment. "I walk in the park near the Athenaeum on Sunday mornings," she said. "I'm there between 9 and 10. I'm not inviting you. I'm telling you where I am." She collected her notebook and her gloves. "Good evening, Arthur." She walked to the door and said something brief and warm to the woman waiting there, and they left together. Arthur stood in the emptied hall for a long time. "I do not think your regret is the same thing as my safety." He turned it over, not as a wound, as a truth, the kind that once you've heard it clearly, you can't argue yourself out of again. He was in the park at 8:30 on Sunday. He told himself it was not eagerness. It was his long-standing tendency toward lateness that Beatrice had always found irritating, and for once in his life he intended to be somewhere early. She arrived at exactly 9. She saw him immediately and did not alter her pace. She said to the woman beside her, the same woman from the Athenaeum, "Will you give us a few minutes?" The woman looked at Arthur with the frank, assessing gaze of someone who had been briefed and was conducting her own evaluation. She nodded and moved ahead on the path. Beatrice sat on a bench. Not close, not far. Measured. "You came," she said. "You told me where you'd be. I also said it wasn't an invitation." "I know. I thought you'd expect me to come anyway." Something moved briefly in her face. Almost not quite humor. "Yes," she said. "I had." He drew a breath and told her what he'd been thinking. Not to argue, not to perform openness, but because she had asked a real question and he was attempting a real answer. He told her that Henry had said she was doing good work with the widow cases, and that the way Henry had said it, he'd realized he had no right to be surprised. He had watched her do the same work for 7 years. He had never called it work, he had called it managing things the way you'd say a clock keeps good time. Not credit, not acknowledgement. Just the expectation of continued function. "I called you Margaret," he said, "in front of everyone, and I didn't know I'd done it. That's the thing I cannot get past. Not that I said it, that it came out of me that easily. As though the name attached to the woman at my table had stopped mattering enough to retain." He looked at his hands briefly, then up. "I've been trying to understand how I became a man who did that to you. And I keep arriving at the same answer. I never had to try. You made everything work so completely that I mistook the absence of difficulty for everything being fine." "It wasn't fine," Beatrice said. "I know that now." "You didn't want to know it then." "No," he said. "I didn't. It would have required something from me that was easier not to give." She turned and looked at him directly then for the first time since she'd sat down. Her face was composed, but composed in the way of something real. This was Beatrice without the management layer. He had almost never seen this. "What do you want, Arthur?" Truthfully. He held her gaze. "I want to know you the way I should have wanted to know you 7 years ago." "That's not the same as wanting me back." "No, it isn't." He looked at her steadily. "I understand I have no right to ask for anything. I'm asking anyway, because the alternative is going home to a house that runs perfectly and is completely empty of everything that made it worth living in." She was quiet for a long moment. The park was beginning to fill with its Sunday morning regulars, other walkers, other conversations, the ordinary life of a Providence winter. Beatrice sat in the middle of it and said carefully, "I need you to understand something. All right, I am not going back to what we were, that arrangement, where I disappear into the management of your life and you move through it without seeing me. I am not going back to that. Not for security. Not for reputation. Not for any reason." She looked at him directly. "I have work here that matters. Women who need what I know how to do. I am a person, Arthur. Not a function. Not a well-run household. A person." "You always were," he said. "I simply didn't see it." "No, you didn't." She held his gaze. "The question I have been sitting with is whether you are capable of seeing it now, not because you feel guilty, not because the house isn't running, but genuinely whether you are capable of looking at me and seeing a person." He didn't answer immediately. She waited. "I don't know," he said. "I think I might be. I believe I'm different than I was a month ago, but I understand that my belief about myself is not the same as proof, and you would be a fool to take my word for it, and you are not a fool." Something in her face shifted. Not dramatically. The way light shifts in early spring. "Come back next Sunday," she said. "Same time, to talk." "To talk," he said. "I'm not promising you anything beyond next Sunday, Arthur, and if you come with the intention of working toward a specific outcome, I will end the conversation and I will not offer another one. Understood. She held his gaze one more moment, then called to the woman on the path ahead, who came back with the expression of a woman who had been watching from a polite distance and had formed several opinions. They walked away together down the park path. Arthur sat on the bench and did not move for a long time. He had come to Providence expecting to retrieve something. He understood now, sitting in the park she walked through every Sunday morning, that what he actually needed to do was far harder and far more uncertain than retrieval. He needed to earn the right to stand beside something he had never properly valued. He did not know if he was capable of it, but for the first time in his adult life, not knowing whether he was capable of something did not make him want to find an easier problem. It made him want to try. He came back the following Sunday, and the one after that. They talked in the park, and then, when February came with its particular cruelty, in the reading room of the Athenaeum, at a small table with books neither of them was reading, Beatrice set the terms and held them with the consistency of a woman who had learned at considerable cost what her own terms were worth. He could not speak about the Boston house. He could not begin a sentence with the words, "when you come home," because there was no version of that sentence she was willing to receive. What he could do was talk and listen, and she found in those first weeks that he was better at the second than she had expected. He asked about the widow cases, not with the polite half-attention of a man tolerating a subject out of obligation, but with the specific focused attention of someone who wanted to understand how it actually worked, what the legal obstacles were, where the system failed, women who were already navigating grief alongside courts that had been designed without them in mind. He asked follow-up questions. He remembered what she had told him the previous week and connected it to what she said this week. It was, Beatrice recognized with a feeling she didn't entirely welcome, the kind of conversation she had wanted from him for 7 years. She did not say this. She stored it and examined it privately. The way you examine something valuable you're not yet certain belongs to you. The woman from the Athenaeum, whose name was Agnes Whitfield, had opinions. She expressed them in the evenings at supper in the frank manner of a woman who considered honesty a form of respect. "He's trying," Agnes said one night. "He is," Beatrice agreed. "The question is whether trying now means anything given how long he wasn't." "You've arrived at exactly the question I'm sitting with." Agnes poured more tea. "What does your gut say?" "My gut says he's genuinely different." Beatrice was quiet a moment. "My gut also says I would have given a great deal for this version of him 3 years ago. 2 years ago. Last year." She set her cup down. "And I don't entirely know what to do with that." Agnes said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. The thing that changed everything did not come from a conversation. In the 3rd week of March, Beatrice went with a widow named Mrs. Corbett to a meeting with an attorney named Graves who handled estate filings in Providence. Graves received them with the particular tolerant condescension she had spent years watching men deploy toward capable women, and she had long since stopped finding it surprising, though she had not stopped finding it infuriating. He reviewed the documents she'd prepared. He acknowledged 2 precedents she had identified, with a slight pause that indicated he had not expected to find them there. Then he mentioned, as an aside, that a Mr. Arthur Reeves of Boston had recently made a contribution to the Providence Women's Legal Aid Society, a sum Graves described as not inconsiderable, specifically directed toward contested estate cases, with the written instruction that no public acknowledgement be attached to the gift. Beatrice went very still. "He asked that his name not appear anywhere," Graves said, "which is unusual. Most men who give that kind of money want a plaque somewhere." He looked at her. "I assumed you were aware." "I was not," Beatrice said. She kept her voice entirely level. She finished the meeting. She walked Mrs. Corbett home. She said goodbye with her usual warmth and then walked back to Agnes's house in the March afternoon and stood in the front room without taking off her coat. He had done it 6 weeks ago, before their first conversation in the park, before any of it. He had done it without telling her, without saving it as evidence in whatever case he was building for himself. She had found out from an attorney who assumed she already knew. She stood there for a long time. Then she sat down in the chair by the window and let herself feel what moved through her, which was not the simple warmth of being won over. It was sharper, the grief underneath the warmth, the unavoidable recognition that this version of him, this one who did things quietly and without credit, had been possible the whole time, had been in him somewhere for 7 years, and she had waited and managed and made herself smaller, and he had never arrived until she'd gone. She let herself feel that, not to punish him with it, not to store it as a weapon, just because it was real and it was hers, and she had spent too many years not allowing herself her own feelings on the grounds that they were inconvenient. Agnes came in an hour later. "You've had news," she said. "He gave money to Graves's legal fund. 6 weeks ago, anonymously directed to estate cases." Beatrice's voice was steady. "He didn't tell me." Agnes sat down. "He didn't use it." "No, he didn't." A long silence. "Well," Agnes said finally, "that's something different." "Yes," Beatrice said, "it is." She did not bring it up the following Sunday. She intended to. But when she sat down across from him and looked at him, she found she couldn't say it yet. He was thinner than he'd been in January, with the particular look of a man who had not been sleeping well and had stopped attempting to conceal it. He asked about Mrs. Corbett's case first, because she had mentioned it the week before, and he had remembered. She answered him, and they talked for the full hour, and she felt the thing she had been feeling for several weeks sharpening into something more specific. It was not forgiveness exactly. Forgiveness implied the damage had a clear boundary that you could step over and find yourself on the other side. This was more like she had stopped bracing. She had stopped waiting for him to slip back into the man who had called her Margaret and turned away. She did not know exactly when that had happened. Henry Marsh came to see her on a Friday in April, with the manner of a man carrying news he was uncertain how to deliver. She received him with coffee because Henry was not the Reeves household, and she had no prohibition against Henry. "He's done something," Henry said. "I need to tell you what it is." She set down her cup. "He's put property in your name," Henry said. "Formally. He consulted 2 attorneys and a judge. It's a legal settlement, your own, independent of the marriage. If you choose never to return to the marriage, you have financial standing that cannot be contested. If you choose to return, it remains yours regardless. He cannot access it. It is yours in a way that Massachusetts law almost never gives a wife anything." Beatrice was quiet. "He asked me to tell you," Henry said, "because he said he couldn't tell you himself without it feeling like leverage. He said it was not leverage. It was." Henry paused, looked at his hands briefly. These were his exact words. He said it was the first real thing he could actually do. Beatrice stood and walked to the window. "The same week as the fund contribution," she said slowly. "Yes. He did both of those things before our first conversation in the park, before any of the letters." "Yes. He wasn't holding them," she said. "He wasn't waiting to use them." "No," Henry said. "He wasn't." She stood at the window long enough that Henry didn't speak, because he knew her well enough to let her have the silence. When she turned back, her face was composed, but her eyes held something more complex than composure. "Henry," she said, "is he genuinely different? Not because I'm gone and he's uncomfortable. Actually different." Henry considered this with the care of a man who understood exactly how much the answer mattered. "I think," he said carefully, "that he has understood something he cannot ununderstand. Whether that understanding changes a man permanently, I can't promise you. What I can tell you is that the Arthur who sat in his study and asked me what he should do sounded nothing like the Arthur who sat in that same study 6 weeks earlier and told me you were making a point and would be back by Tuesday." He paused. "Something broke open in him. I believe it's real. I cannot guarantee it stays open." Beatrice nodded slowly. "That's an honest answer. You always ask for one." She looked at him. "You're one of the few people who gives them to me." She was quiet a moment. "What am I going to do, Henry?" "I think," he said, "you already know." She sent Arthur a note that evening. Come to supper Sunday. 7 o'clock. Bring nothing. He arrived at 10 minutes to 7. Agnes let him in with the expression of a woman who had cooked this meal under specific conditions and intended those conditions to be known. The table was small. 3 settings: Beatrice, Arthur, Agnes, who was not a servant at this table but a woman who lived in this house, whose presence Beatrice had made clear was not negotiable. Arthur sat down without comment on the size of the table or the number of settings. He said, "Something smells remarkable." Agnes said, "It's lamb. Don't say anything else until you've tasted it." He said, "Yes, ma'am." And Beatrice caught Agnes's eye across the table, and Agnes very slightly raised her eyebrow, and Beatrice very slightly shook her head, and an entire conversation was conducted without words. The supper was good. The conversation moved carefully at first. Mrs. Corbett's case, the Graves meeting, a bill before the Massachusetts legislature that Henry had mentioned. And then, slowly, as the evening settled, somewhere more ordinary, Arthur told a story about a railway committee meeting that made Agnes laugh for real, and Beatrice added a detail he hadn't known, and he looked at her and said, "How did you know that?" "I know everything, Arthur," Beatrice said. "I always have." And the table laughed. Afterward, Agnes excused herself with the decisive tact of a woman who knew exactly when to leave a room. Arthur and Beatrice sat across the small table with the last of the coffee between them. "I know about the settlement documents," she said. He went very still. "And the fund contribution," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once, slowly. "I didn't want either of them to be." "I know what you didn't want them to be," she said. "And they weren't. That's what I'm saying." She held his gaze. "You did it the right way. You did it the way I would have done it for you. 7 years of doing things the right way for you, and you never asked anything back. And you did these things without expecting me to, and without telling me, and someone should tell you that they were seen." He was quiet for a long time. "You told me," he said finally. "That's enough." She looked at him across the small table. "I am not coming back to Boston," she said. "I will keep this house. I will keep my work. I will keep Agnes, who will make up her own mind about you in her own time." She kept her eyes on his. "I am Beatrice Holt in my own right, not as an extension of your household or your calendar or your standing. That does not change." "I would not ask it to," he said. "Not for anything." She held his gaze. Then she said slowly, "I think we might try to build something." He did not move. "What kind of something?" "Something that has never existed before between us. Not a restoration. Not going back to what we had and calling it repaired." She paused. "Something new. Build on different terms. I am not your wife in the old sense. I am not a function in your household. If you come into my life, you come into my life. You come to Agnes's table. You sit through lectures at the Athenaeum. You understand that my work matters and you treat it as such, in public, in front of people who will observe and remember." "Yes," he said. "Simply, without condition. And if I look across any table we ever share and see that expression, the look of a man who is not seeing the person across from him, I will tell you directly, and I expect you to hear it." "I will hear it," he said. "I will not disappear again," she said. "Not for comfort, not for peace. If something is wrong, I will say it. I am learning," he said, "to receive that." She studied his face for a long moment. The small house around them was quiet, the way houses are quiet when the people inside them have arrived somewhere true. "There's a lecture at the Athenaeum on Tuesday evening," she said. "Mrs. Adler is speaking again, on contested property rights and second marriages. I intend to challenge 2 of her conclusions publicly, and I would like you in the room." Something moved across his face that was warmer than a smile and more careful. "You want me in the room while you publicly challenge a respected attorney." "I want you in the room," she said, "because I want to look up and see someone who is proud of me doing it, not tolerating it, not managing his expression. Proud. Can you do that?" "Yes," he said. without hesitation, without qualification. Beatrice nodded. Tuesday, then. 7 o'clock. Don't be late. The Athenaeum lecture on Tuesday drew a good crowd. Mrs. Adler spoke well, as she generally did, and when she finished, the floor opened for questions. Beatrice raised her hand from her seat in the third row. She stood and offered a challenge to two of Adler's positions on contested inheritance. Specific, sharp, citing 3 cases and the precise language of the statute that complicated Adler's argument. The room had the particular quality it sometimes got when someone asked a question that was unmistakably better than the lecture it followed. Adler answered. Beatrice responded. Adler conceded a point. The room murmured. A man near the front leaned to his companion and said, not quietly enough, "Who is she?" Before his companion could answer, Arthur Reeves, seated 4 rows behind them, said clearly, without being asked, "Mrs. Beatrice Reeves. She organized the Providence Widows Legal Petition Network. There is no one in this room who understands the property courts the way she does." The man turned, recognized Arthur, and nodded with this slightly startled respect of someone recalibrating. Beatrice, 3 rows ahead, heard it. She did not turn around immediately. She let it move through her, the way something genuinely new moves through a person who has waited a long time for it without quite believing it was coming. Then she turned her head, just slightly. Just enough. Arthur was looking at her. Not with the absent gaze of a man looking toward a sound, not with the managed expression of a man maintaining appearances. With full, unperformed attention. The look of a man who saw the woman across the room and knew exactly who she was. Beatrice looked back at him across those 3 rows, and she smiled. Not the smile she had worn at the Caldwell dinner in January, that door-closing smile. The composed exit of a woman who had finally made her decision. Not the careful managed smile of 7 years of making everything work without credit. This smile was different. It was the smile of a woman who had walked out of a well-appointed house in the January cold, with a trunk and a letter in her coat pocket, who had built something real in a Providence house with a woman who argued with her about property law over lamb and tea, who had sat across a small supper table and offered terms on her own authority, and watched the man she had once given everything to choose, with his eyes open and nothing to gain but the truth, to meet her on her ground. It was the smile of a woman who had not left to punish anyone, who had left because staying had become a way of betraying herself, and who had discovered, on the other side of that leaving, that she was not someone who needed to be retrieved, or forgiven, or restored. She was someone who needed to be seen, and in a Providence lecture hall on a Tuesday evening in April, in the voice of a man who said her name clearly and without hesitation and without being asked, Beatrice Holt turned back to Mrs. Adler, raised her notes, and continued her argument. She had work to do.